The Lord will bless his people with peace. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. Jesus enjoined them, "Watch out, guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." He concluded among themselves that it was because they had no bread. When he became aware of this, he said to them, "Why do you conclude that it is because you have no bread? Do you not yet understand or comprehend? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and not see, ears and not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many wicker baskets full of fragments you picked up?" They answered him, 12. "When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many full baskets of fragments did you pick up?" They answered him, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" The Gospel of the Lord. Today we start getting into the story of Noah here, and we see that the Lord had repented of what he had caused in creation. He regretted that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was grieved. It wasn't so much that God repented. God doesn't actually change his mind. There are parts of the Bible where basically human attributes are attributed to God. But technically speaking, God does not change his mind. He foresaw from the beginning what would happen. God sees all things to him immediately. But what's interesting here about the book of Genesis is the question should arise, right, where did all of this evil come from? We skipped over a chapter yesterday in order to get to this chapter 6 of Genesis. Chapter 5 of Genesis and chapter 4 basically describes the 2 genealogies. Right, so we know that Adam and Eve, we know from Genesis that they had at least 3 sons, right, Cain and Abel, and then Seth. And obviously Abel died. They most likely had many more children than that, because otherwise who else would Cain and Seth have been marrying? But basically, chapter 4 and chapter 5, they give this kind of interesting genealogy. And what you see is that there's basically a comparison between Cain's descendants and a comparison between Seth's descendants. So Cain, as you might imagine, right, being the wicked man that he was, so likewise his descendants became very wicked. And if you read the genealogy carefully, it says that Cain, he founded cities, and he named one of the cities after his son, which was a sign of arrogance. When the sons of Seth are described, it says that they were always calling upon the name of the Lord. They weren't so much focused on their own importance, but as calling on the name of the Lord, right? Worshiping God. Another interesting thing about one of Cain's descendants is that it says that he was a maker of bronze, right, and all instruments used in war. So basically, some of Cain's descendants, they became the first ones to create war, a terrible scourge that still exists today. The last descendant of Cain that is mentioned is the man named Lamech. Lamech is the first person after Cain and Abel who is a murderer in the Bible. And not only is he a murderer, but he has 2 different wives. God never told man to take 2 wives. In the beginning, it was just Adam and Eve. So polygamy became to be significant, right, in the line of Cain. The lines of Seth, however, are much different. Like I already said, they call upon the name of the Lord. The descendants of Seth are called sons of God because Seth was made in the image and likeness of his father. And so there's this contrast between these two cities. All the early church fathers, they always saw these genealogies as like an example of the city of man compared to the city of God. That all throughout history, there are human beings who are, for the most part, members of the city of man, which is built on vice and bloodshed and greed and sin. And then there are members of the city of God, the people who are always trying to reform humanity, always trying to glorify God. So that is partly why, right, God decides to flood the earth. There needs to be a new beginning. The last descendant of Seth that is mentioned in Genesis is this descendant Noah. Right? Noah, right? He's going to appear with the flood. Now, I just wanted to talk about all these things because it's important for us to understand this connection. It's also significant because there's a very controversial passage that, again, the church skipped over this morning, probably because it's so controversial. But some of you may have heard about the controversy about the sons of God or the Nephilim. How many of you ever heard of the Nephilim before? Right, so some of you, yeah. Right? The Nephilim are basically, in the Bible, the Nephilim are described as people who were giants. So like when Joshua and the Israelites, when they were getting ready to go into Jericho, right, Moses sent in the spies, and the spies said, the people there are like giants. We are like ants in their sight. Goliath, the Philistine, is presumed to be a descendant of those same Nephilim. The famous antagonist around the time of the Tower of Babel was a man named Nimrod. Nimrod was claimed to be a Nephilim. The idea of the Nephilim comes from the 6th chapter of Genesis, and we skipped over it. So I told you about this, the descendants of Seth and Cain, right? And in Genesis chapter 6, there's a verse that says, "And then the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and so they took the daughters of men in marriage, as many as they desired." So what many people interpret that as is it's talking about the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. Seth is the sons of God, right, is his line. And so the sons of Seth began to intermarry with the descendants of Cain, and it caused a lot of problems. All throughout the Old Testament, we see that when the Israelites intermarry with unfaithful peoples, right, it leads to bad consequences because they often bring their own religion. And so there are many scholars who say that that's what happened in Genesis chapter 6. It's talking about the descendants of Seth intermarrying with the descendants of Cain. And it was in a polygamous way. It says they took as many of them as they desired. But the other interpretation, which has never been fully endorsed by the church hasn't fully endorsed either of these interpretations, but it's still significant because many people wonder about these Nephilim. The traditional understanding in the majority of early Christianity and early Jewish commentators is that when it's talking about the sons of God, it's talking about angels. Angels saw that the daughters of men, aka human beings, were fair and to be desired. And so they intermarried with them, or they had relations with them. And that's where you get these Nephilim. Personally, I think both interpretations are very convincing, and so I'll leave you to make the decision for yourself. However, most people who deny the angelic interpretation, the reason why they say is that it's impossible for angels who don't have bodies to have relations with humanity. The people who say that, I would argue, are missing some important aspects of angelic interpretation. Even St. Thomas Aquinas talked about the possibility of angels being able to have relations with men. There are certain kinds of demons who do this. So all this is just very interesting to discuss. I know there's not anything like really edifying, like inspiring about this, but it's significant because if you're going to read the Bible, without fail, this is going to come up. And I think it's important for all of us just to be aware of this very significant chapter of Genesis and how people understand it, because it has great consequences on what happens later on in salvation history.